rancher raised her after her father died on her 18th birthday. She sat on his lap and whispered. The gunshot echoed across the valley like thunder, sending a flock of ravens spiraling into the copper sunset. 18-year-old Cassandra Vale pressed her back against the weathered barn wall, her heart hammering against her ribs as she clutched the leather satchel to her chest. Inside were documents that could change everything or get her killed. 3 days ago, she had been nothing more than an orphan working tables at Murphy's Saloon in Tombstone, Arizona Territory. Today, she was the rightful owner of the largest cattle ranch in Cochise County, and someone was willing to kill to keep that secret buried. The dust kicked up by the approaching riders settled slowly in the still evening air. Cassandra could hear their voices now, low and menacing, drifting across the abandoned homestead where she had taken refuge. She recognized the gravelly tone of Jake Murdoch, the man who had claimed her father's ranch after his mysterious death 12 years ago. She was here, Murdoch growled to his men. Horse tracks lead right to this place. Search every building. Cassandra's fingers traced the edge of the will hidden in her satchel, the document that proved Samuel Vale had never sold his ranch to Murdoch. Her father had been murdered and the deed forged. She had the evidence, but she was one woman against 6 armed men in a territory where justice often came from the barrel of a gun. The sound of spurs jangling against hardpack grew closer. Through a gap in the barn wall, she could see Murdoch's weathered face beneath his black hat, his cold gray eyes scanning the property like a predator searching for prey. Behind him rode his foreman, a scarred man called Snake Peters, and 4 other hired guns whose reputations were written in Boot Hill graveyards across the territory. "Boss," Snake Peters called out, his voice carrying a distinctly sinister edge, "found fresh water in the trough. Someone's been here recent." Murdoch's jaw tightened beneath his salt and pepper beard. He had built his empire on lies and violence, turning the Vale Ranch into the most profitable operation in the territory through intimidation and murder. The last thing he needed was Samuel Vale's daughter showing up with proof of his crimes. Cassandra closed her eyes and tried to steady her breathing. She thought of her father, not the man she had never known, but the stories she had heard whispered in the saloon when folks thought she was not listening. Samuel Vale had been an honest rancher, a man who treated his workers fairly and stood up to the corrupt cattle barons who were bleeding the territory dry. His death had been ruled an accident, a fall from his horse during a storm, but the old-timers knew better. The barn door creaked open with a sound like breaking bones. Cassandra held her breath as heavy footsteps moved across the straw-covered floor. Her hiding spot behind a stack of rotting hay bales felt impossibly small as the footsteps drew nearer. "Nothing in here but rats and memories," one of the gunmen called out. But Murdoch was not satisfied. His boots scraped against the wooden planks as he moved deeper into the barn, and Cassandra could smell the tobacco and whiskey that seemed to follow him like a cloud. She pressed herself deeper into the shadows, praying the gathering darkness would keep her hidden. "She knows," Murdoch muttered to himself, his voice barely audible. Somehow that girl found out the truth. The truth was more complicated than even Murdoch realized. Cassandra had not stumbled upon her inheritance by accident. 3 months ago, a dying lawyer named Henry Morrison had appeared at Murphy's Saloon, consumed by guilt and rotgut whiskey. In his final moments of lucidity, he had pressed the hidden documents into her hands and whispered the story of how he had been forced to forge her father's will at gunpoint. Morrison had kept the original documents hidden for 12 years, waiting for the courage to make things right. His deathbed confession had given Cassandra more than just proof of her birthright. It had given her a purpose that burned hotter than the Arizona sun. The footsteps moved away from her hiding place, but Murdoch's voice carried clearly in the still air. "She cannot have gone far on foot. Peters, take Johnson and Miller and check the old mining camps up in the hills. The rest of us will search the creek bed. If she is trying to reach the Marshall in Tucson, she will need water for the journey." Cassandra waited until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance before emerging from her hiding place. The abandoned homestead belonged to the Hendricks family, former neighbors of her father who had been driven off their land by Murdoch's expanding operation. Like so many others, they had been given a choice: sell for a fraction of their property's worth or face the consequences. The consequences usually involved mysterious accidents, burned barns, and poisoned water sources. Murdoch had perfected the art of legal theft, using the corrupt territorial courts and hired guns to build his empire one murdered dream at a time. But Cassandra was not like the other victims. She had spent her childhood in the roughest saloon in Tombstone, learning to read people's intentions in their eyes and their movements. She could handle a gun almost as well as she could pour whiskey, and she had absorbed the hard lessons of frontier survival like a desert plant absorbing rare rainfall. More importantly, she was not alone. The letter hidden in her satchel alongside her father's will bore the signature of James McKenna, a former ranch hand who had worked for her father and witnessed Murdoch's crimes firsthand. McKenna now operated a small horse ranch near the Mexican border, and he had promised to help her reclaim what was rightfully hers. The moon was rising over the eastern mountains, casting silver light across the desert landscape. Cassandra knew she had to move quickly. Murdoch's men would return to search more thoroughly once they realized she had slipped through their net, and her mare was hidden in an arroyo 2 miles to the south. She made her way carefully across the hardpack, keeping to the shadows and watching for any sign of the returning riders. The desert night was alive with sounds, coyotes calling to each other in the distance, the rustle of small creatures moving through the sagebrush, the whisper of wind through the ocotillo plants that dotted the landscape like skeletal sentries. As she walked, Cassandra thought about the life she was leaving behind. Murphy's saloon had been her world for as long as she could remember. A place where whiskey flowed like water and violence was always one carelessly spoken word away. She had learned to navigate that dangerous environment through wit and determination, earning the grudging respect of cowboys, miners, and drifters who passed through Tombstone like tumbleweeds. But she had always felt like something was missing, some essential part of herself that remained hidden beneath the surface. Now she knew what it was: her true identity as the daughter of Samuel Vale, heir to thousands of acres of prime grazing land, and the legacy of a man who had died fighting for what was right. The arroyo where she had hidden her horse was a narrow gash in the earth, carved by flash floods over countless centuries. Her mare, a sturdy bay named Dusty, nickered softly as she approached. Cassandra had bought the horse with money saved from her wages at the saloon, recognizing the intelligence and endurance that would be essential for survival in the unforgiving territory. As she prepared to mount up, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her freeze. 3 riders were moving along the ridge above the arroyo, their silhouettes black against the star-filled sky. She recognized Murdoch's voice carrying on the night air. "Spread out. She has to be somewhere in this area. Check every hiding place, every shadow." Cassandra led Dusty deeper into the arroyo, moving as quietly as possible over the rocky ground. The walls of the narrow canyon would provide cover, but they would also trap her if Murdoch's men found the entrance. She had to reach McKenna's ranch before dawn, and that meant traveling 25 miles across open desert while avoiding the search parties that were undoubtedly scouring the territory. The documents in her satchel seemed to burn against her chest as she mounted her horse and urged Dusty into a careful walk along the arroyo floor. Every step brought her closer to a confrontation that had been building for 12 years, a reckoning that would determine whether justice still meant something in the Arizona territory or whether men like Murdoch could continue to build their empires on the bones of honest folk. Above her, the voices of the searchers grew fainter as they moved away from the arroyo. But Cassandra knew this was only the beginning. Murdoch had too much to lose to give up easily, and he had the resources and ruthlessness to hunt her across the entire territory if necessary. The trail ahead wound through some of the most dangerous country in Arizona desert where the sun could kill a person in hours, mountains where Apache war parties still struck without warning, and towns where Murdoch's money could buy any service, including murder. But Cassandra had advantages that Murdoch did not fully understand. She knew this land intimately from her years of listening to the stories told by cowboys and prospectors in Murphy's saloon. She had absorbed their knowledge of water sources, safe trails, and places to take shelter like a scholar studying ancient texts. More importantly, she had inherited her father's determination and his unwillingness to back down from a fight. The arroyo eventually opened onto a broad plain dotted with mesquite and palo verde trees. Cassandra could see the lights of distant ranches twinkling like earthbound stars, each one representing a family trying to carve out a life in the harsh but beautiful territory. Some of those families were honest folk who would help a woman in trouble. Others were in Murdoch's pocket and would turn her over for the bounty he was certain to place on her head. She urged Dusty into a steady lope across the desert floor, navigating by the stars and the landmarks she had memorized from countless conversations with travelers. The night air was cool against her face, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of rain that might never come. Behind her, she could still see the flickering lights of torches as Murdoch's men continued their search. They would find her trail eventually, even in the darkness. An experienced tracker could follow horse sign across the hardpack. But every mile she put between herself and her pursuers improved her chances of reaching McKenna's ranch alive. The moon climbed higher, casting everything in silver light that made the desert landscape look like the surface of an alien world. Cassandra had always loved the way the territory looked in the moonlight, with its stark beauty and sense of infinite possibility. Tonight, that beauty was tinged with danger, but it was still her country, the land her father had died trying to protect. As she rode, she thought about the confrontation that awaited her. Even if she reached McKenna safely, even if they could gather enough evidence to expose Murdoch's crimes, the corrupt territorial courts might still rule in his favor. Justice in Arizona Territory often depended more on who had the most money and guns than on who had the law on their side. But Cassandra had learned something important during her years in Murphy's saloon. Sometimes the only way to defeat a bully was to face them head-on, regardless of the odds. Her father had understood that principle, and it had cost him his life. She was prepared to pay the same price if necessary, but she was also determined to be smarter and more ruthless than Murdoch expected. The desert stretched endlessly ahead of her, filled with danger and promise in equal measure. Somewhere out there was James McKenna and the alliance she needed to reclaim her birthright. Between here and there lay 20 miles of hostile territory, armed enemies, and the unforgiving challenge of the Arizona night. Cassandra touched the satchel containing her father's will one more time, then urged Dusty into a faster pace. The real fight was just beginning. Miles passed beneath Dusty's hooves as they traversed the moonlit desert. The landscape shifted from flat hardpack to rolling hills dotted with beryl cacti and ocotillo, plants that reached toward the star-filled sky like gnarled fingers. Cassandra kept to the low ground when possible, using arroyos and natural depressions to mask her passage from any watchers on the ridgelines. The night was far from silent. Desert creatures went about their nocturnal business, the yip of coyotes echoing off distant canyon walls, the rustle of kangaroo rats scurrying between creosote bushes, the haunting call of a great horned owl somewhere in the darkness. These were the sounds of her homeland, as familiar to her as the voices of the saloon patrons she had served for years. But tonight, those natural sounds were punctuated by something more ominous, the distant thunder of hoofbeats as search parties crisscrossed the territory. Murdoch had clearly called in favors from other ranchers and hired every available gun in the county. The bounty on her head must be substantial to warrant such an extensive manhunt. As Dusty picked her way carefully down a rocky slope, Cassandra caught sight of a campfire flickering in a sheltered canyon about a mile to the east. Her first instinct was to avoid it entirely in this territory. Strangers around a campfire could mean anything from helpful travelers to bandits or worse. But something about the scene made her pause and study it more carefully. The fire was small and well concealed, the kind of camp made by someone who understood the importance of staying hidden. More telling was the way the horses were picketed, not in the casual manner of ordinary travelers, but with the military precision of someone who expected trouble and wanted to be ready to ride at a moment's notice. Through her spyglass, borrowed from Murphy's collection of pawned items, Cassandra could make out two figures sitting by the fire. One was a tall man in a worn cavalry jacket, his graying hair visible beneath a battered campaign hat. The other was smaller, possibly a woman, though it was difficult to tell at this distance in the flickering firelight. The decision to approach them was not easy. Every instinct told her to keep moving toward McKenna's ranch, to avoid unnecessary contact with strangers who might recognize her or turn her over to Murdoch for the reward money. But something about the military bearing of the man by the fire sparked a memory from her saloon days. She remembered stories told by old soldiers who had served in the Apache wars, tales of cavalry officers who had tried to bring honor and justice to a territory plagued by corruption and violence. Most of those officers had been transferred or forced out when they became inconvenient to the political machine that kept men like Murdoch in power. Could this be one of those displaced soldiers? Someone who might sympathize with her cause and provide assistance or at least safe passage through the night? The risk was enormous, but the potential reward might be worth taking the chance. Cassandra urged Dusty down into the canyon, approaching the camp slowly with her hands visible and making enough noise to announce her presence. The military discipline she had observed proved accurate. Both figures were on their feet with weapons drawn before she got within 50 yards of their fire. "That's far enough, stranger," the man called out in a voice that carried the authority of long command. "State your business and keep your hands where we can see them. I am looking for safe passage to the south." Cassandra replied, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I mean no harm and carry no weapons except what a woman needs to protect herself in this country." Man studied her for a long moment, taking in her dusty traveling clothes and the exhaustion that showed in every line of her posture. His companion, now clearly visible as a woman in men's clothing, whispered something urgent in his ear. "Dismount slowly and walk into the firelight," he commanded. "Keep your hands visible at all times." As Cassandra complied with his instructions, she got her first clear look at her potential saviors. The man was indeed a former cavalry officer, probably in his 50s, with the weathered face and steady eyes of someone who had seen too much violence but still believed in doing what was right. His companion was a woman of about 30. Dressed in practical trail clothes and carrying herself with the confidence of someone comfortable in dangerous situations. "I am Captain Marcus Webb, formerly of the 4th Cavalry," the man said, his voice formal but not unfriendly. "This is Miss Sarah Chun, a journalist from San Francisco. We are traveling to Tucson on business that does not concern you. Now, who are you and why are you riding alone through hostile territory at night?" The mention of Tucson sent a jolt of hope through Cassandra. If these travelers were heading to the territorial capital, they might provide exactly the protection she needed to reach safety and present her evidence to honest authorities. "My name is Cassandra Vale," she said, deciding that honesty might serve her better than deception. "I am the daughter of Samuel Vale, who owned a ranch in this territory before his death 12 years ago." The effect of her words was immediate and dramatic. Captain Webb's eyes widened with recognition, and Sarah Chun stepped forward into the firelight with obvious interest. "Samuel Vale," Webb repeated slowly. "I knew your father, Miss Vale. He was one of the few honest ranchers in the territory, a man who treated everyone fairly regardless of their background. His death was a great loss." Sarah Chun was studying Cassandra with the sharp gaze of a trained investigator. "I have heard stories about the Vale Ranch and what happened after your father died. Jake Murdoch claimed the property through some questionable legal maneuvering, if I remember correctly." "It was murder," Cassandra said flatly. "And I have the proof." She pulled the leather satchel from beneath her coat and showed them the documents inside her father's original will, the lawyer's confession, and other evidence that Morrison had collected over the years. Both Webb and Chun examined the papers carefully by the firelight, their expressions growing increasingly grim. "This is dynamite," Chun said quietly. "These documents prove that Murdoch has been operating the largest ranch in the territory under fraudulent ownership for over a decade. The territorial governor will have to act on evidence this clear." But Webb was shaking his head with the bitter expression of a man who had seen too much corruption go unpunished. "You assume the territorial governor is not in Murdoch's pocket along with everyone else. Miss Vale, do you have any idea how much money and influence we are talking about here?" "I know exactly what I am up against," Cassandra replied with steel in her voice. "But I also know that some things are worth fighting for, regardless of the odds. My father died trying to do what was right, and I will not dishonor his memory by running away from this fight." Sarah Chun was nodding approvingly. "I came to Arizona Territory to investigate corruption in the cattle industry for my newspaper. These documents are exactly what I need to expose the entire system. Miss Vale, I would like to propose an alliance that could benefit both of us." Webb looked uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "Ladies, I admire your determination, but you are talking about taking on one of the most powerful and ruthless men in the territory. Murdoch has killed to protect his interests before, and he will not hesitate to do so again. Which is exactly why we need your help, Captain," Cassandra said. "You have military training and experience dealing with corrupt officials. More importantly, you have a reputation for honor that could give us credibility with honest authorities." The sound of distant hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. All three turned toward the canyon rim, where torches flickered like malevolent stars against the night sky. Murdoch's search parties were getting closer, and their hidden camp would not remain secret much longer. "We need to move," Webb said tersely. "If those are Murdoch's men, and they find us together, it will go badly for all of us." "But Sarah," Chen was already packing her gear with the efficiency of someone accustomed to quick departures from dangerous situations. "Then we travel together to Tucson. Safety in numbers, and we all have business in the territorial capital." Cassandra felt a surge of hope as she realized she might have found the allies she desperately needed. Webb's military expertise and Chun's connections in the newspaper industry could provide exactly the combination of protection and publicity required to expose Murdoch's crimes. They broke camp quickly and efficiently, scattering the fire and covering their tracks as well as possible in the limited time available. The approaching search party was still several miles away, but experienced trackers would eventually find signs of their presence if given enough time to search thoroughly. As they rode south through the moonlit desert, Sarah Chun moved her horse alongside Cassandra's mar. "Tell me about your father," she said quietly. "What kind of man was Samuel Vale?" "I never knew him," Cassandra admitted. "He died when I was 6, and I grew up in Tombstone working in a saloon. But everyone who knew him said he was different from the other ranchers fair to his workers, honest in his dealings, willing to stand up to the cattle barons who were bleeding the territory dry. And that is why they killed him," Webb added grimly from nearby. "Men like Samuel Vale are dangerous to the established order. They show other people that it is possible to succeed without corruption, and that threatens the entire system." The miles passed beneath their horses' hooves as they made their way toward the distant lights of a way station that marked the halfway point to Tucson. Behind them, the search parties continued their sweep of the desert, their torches creating a web of light across the landscape like hunters pursuing prey. But Cassandra no longer felt like helpless prey. With Webb's military knowledge and Chun's investigative skills supporting her cause, she had a real chance of bringing Murdoch to justice and reclaiming her father's legacy. The documents in her satchel represented more than just her inheritance. They were the key to exposing a system of corruption that had poisoned the entire territory. The desert wind carried the scent of distant rain, and Cassandra allowed herself to hope that the drought of justice that had gripped Arizona territory for so long might finally be coming to an end. The way station appeared ahead of them like a beacon in the darkness, a low adobe building surrounded by corrals and outbuildings, with yellow light spilling from its windows onto the hard-packed yard. Smoke rose from the chimney, and they could hear the sound of voices and laughter from within. It was the kind of place where travelers could find food, water, and a few hours of rest before continuing their journey across the unforgiving territory. But it was also the kind of place where information was traded along with supplies, and where the wrong word to the wrong person could mean death for someone carrying documents that could topple empires. "We need to be careful," Webb warned as they approached the station. "Word travels fast in country like this, and Murdoch probably has friends or paid informants at every stop between here and Tucson." Sarah Chen was already studying the horses tied at the hitching rail, looking for any sign that Murdoch's men had reached the station ahead of them. "I count 6 horses besides the station keeper's animals. Could be innocent travelers, or it could be trouble." Cassandra felt the familiar weight of the documents against her chest and made a decision that surprised even herself. "I am going in alone," she announced. "If there are hostile people inside, better they see one woman than 3 travelers together. You can watch from outside and write for help if things go wrong." Both of her companions started to object, but Cassandra was already dismounting and checking the small revolver concealed beneath her coat. Years of working in Murphy's saloon had taught her to read dangerous situations and react accordingly. She had talked her way out of trouble more often than she had fought her way out, but she was prepared for either option. The interior of the way station was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of cooking food. A dozen men sat at rough wooden tables, most of them looking like honest travelers or local ranchers stopping for a meal and a drink. But Cassandra's experienced eye immediately picked out the 3 men sitting near the back wall, hard-faced gunmen with the kind of alertness that came from living by violence. She recognized one of them as Tom Bradley, a hired killer who had been drinking at Murphy's saloon just 2 weeks ago. He had been asking questions about her then, claiming to be interested in her availability for private employment. Now she knew what kind of employment he had been talking about. Bradley had not seen her yet. His attention was focused on a conversation with the station keeper about recent travelers passing through. But it would only be a matter of time before he noticed her, and when he did, her disguise as just another traveler would be blown. Cassandra moved to the bar and ordered coffee and hardtack, keeping her hat pulled low and her voice pitched differently than her natural speaking tone. The station keeper was a grizzled old man who had probably seen every kind of trouble the territory could produce, and he served her without comment or curiosity. "Been quiet tonight," she said casually, testing the waters. "Expected more traffic on the Tucson road." "Oh, it has been plenty busy," the station keeper replied. "Had Jake Murdoch's foreman through here not 2 hours ago with a whole crew of riders. Looking for someone, they said. Offered good money for information about a young woman traveling alone." Cassandra's blood ran cold, but she kept her expression neutral. "Hope they find what they are looking for," she said with forced casualness. "Snake Peters seemed to think they would," the old man continued. "Said they had the whole territory covered from here to the Mexican border. Whoever they are hunting, she picked a bad time to run." The mention of Snake Peters confirmed Cassandra's worst fears. Murdoch's most trusted enforcer was already ahead of them, probably setting up ambushes at every logical stopping point between here and Tucson. The net was tightening, and her window of opportunity was closing fast. Bradley chose that moment to look up from his conversation, and his eyes locked onto Cassandra's face with the recognition of a predator spotting prey. She saw his hand drift toward his gun even as he tried to maintain a casual expression. "Well, I will be," Bradley said loudly enough to catch the attention of his companions. Look what the desert wind blew in. The station fell silent as everyone turned to look at Cassandra. She could feel the tension building like the electrical charge before a lightning strike, and she knew that violence was only seconds away. Her hand moved toward her concealed weapon, but she was outnumbered 3-1 in close quarters. That was when Captain Webb stepped through the door with his service revolver all ready, drawn and pointed at Bradley's chest. Sarah Chun followed immediately behind him, her own weapon steady in practiced hands. "I would advise against any sudden movements, gentlemen," Webb said in the calm voice of a man who had faced down hostile forces many times before. "Miss Chun and I are prepared to defend ourselves and our traveling companion." Bradley's face twisted with frustrated rage, but he was smart enough to recognize when he was outgunned. "This is not over," he snarled at Cassandra. "Murdoch has a long reach, and you cannot run forever." "Maybe not," Cassandra replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "But I can run long enough to see justice done." They backed out of the way station carefully, keeping their weapons trained on the hostile gunmen until they reached their horses. The other travelers in the station watched in fascination but made no move to interfere in Arizona territory. Smart people stayed out of other folks' business unless they wanted to end up in Boot Hill. As they rode away from the way station at a fast gallop, Sarah Chun called out over the thunder of hoofbeats. "That was well played, but now they know exactly where we are and which direction we are heading." Webb nodded grimly. "They will send word ahead to every station in town between here and Tucson. We are going to have to travel cross-country and avoid the main roads entirely." Cassandra felt a fierce satisfaction despite the increased danger. The confrontation at the way station had proven that she was not just running away, she was fighting back, and she had allies who were willing to risk their lives for her cause. The documents in her satchel were more than just evidence now. They were a declaration of war against the corruption that had poisoned her homeland for too long. The desert stretched endlessly ahead of them, filled with challenges that would test their determination and resourcefulness to the limit. But for the first time since finding her father's will, Cassandra felt like she might actually have a chance to win this fight and reclaim her birthright. Behind them, the lights of the way station faded into the darkness, but the memory of Bradley's threatening words echoed in her mind like a promise of the battles yet to come. Dawn broke over the Dragoon Mountains like a crimson wound across the eastern sky. Cassandra, Webb, and Chun had ridden hard through the night, abandoning the main trail to follow deer paths and ancient Apache routes through the most treacherous country in the territory. Their horses were exhausted, their water was running low, and somewhere behind them, Snake Peters and his hunters were closing the distance with every passing hour. They took shelter in a narrow canyon where a seasonal creek had carved deep pools into the red sandstone. The horses drank greedily while the three fugitives assessed their situation with the grim efficiency of people who understood how close they were to death. 15 miles to Tucson, Webb said, studying his compass and the surrounding landmarks. But Peters will have men watching every approach to the town. We need a plan that gets us to the territorial courthouse alive. Sarah. Chun was examining the documents from Cassandra's satchel one more time, her journalist's mind already working on how to present the evidence for maximum impact. These papers will cause a sensation when they are published. But first, we need to get them to someone in authority who cannot be bought or intimidated. Judge Harrison, Cassandra said suddenly. He is the only honest man left in the territorial government. My father mentioned him in letters that the lawyer Morrison saved. Harrison refused Murdoch's bribes and ruled against him in 2 separate cases before political pressure forced him to back down. Webb nodded approvingly. I know Harrison by reputation. Former Union Army colonel, served with distinction at Gettysburg. If anyone will stand up to Murdoch, it will be him. But their conversation was interrupted by the sound they had been dreading, hoofbeats echoing off the canyon walls as a large group of riders approached their hiding place. Through gaps in the rocks, they could see Snake Peters leading at least a dozen men, their weapons ready and their faces set with the determination of hunters who had finally cornered their prey. Found their tracks leading into this canyon, Peters called out to his men. "No way out except the way they came in. We have them trapped." Cassandra felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized the desperate nature of their situation. The canyon walls were too steep to climb, the creek too shallow to provide cover, and they were outnumbered 4-1 by experienced killers who had no qualms about murdering anyone who threatened their employer's empire. But Captain Webb was already moving with the tactical precision of a veteran cavalry officer. "Chun, take the horses and work your way up the creek bed. There might be a way out through those rocks at the far end. Miss Vale, you are with me. We are going to make these bastards pay for every yard of ground." Sarah Chun started to object, but Webb cut her off with military authority. "Those documents are more important than any of our lives. Get them to Judge Harrison no matter what happens to us." The journalist understood the logic even as she hated the necessity. She took Cassandra's satchel and began leading the horses upstream while Webb and Cassandra positioned themselves behind the largest boulders they could find. "Ever been in a real gunfight?" Webb asked quietly as he checked his ammunition. "No," Cassandra admitted, "but I have been in plenty of bar fights, and I imagine the principles are similar. Hit hard, hit fast, and do not give your enemy time to think." Webb smiled grimly. "Your father would be proud of you." The first shots echoed through the canyon like thunder as Peters and his men advanced up the creek bed. Webb's military training showed immediately his shots were precise and economical, each bullet finding its mark or forcing the attackers to take cover. Cassandra fired more instinctively, but her years of handling difficult customers in Murphy's saloon had given her steady nerves under pressure. "They are flanking us on the left," Webb observed calmly, even as bullets chipped stone inches from his head. "When I give the signal, we fall back to the next defensive position." But Peters was too experienced to be drawn into a prolonged firefight. Instead of pressing the attack, he called out across the canyon in a voice that carried the confidence of a man who held all the cards. "Miss Vale, I know you can hear me. Mr. Murdoch wants to make you a deal. Surrender those documents, and you can ride out of here alive. Keep fighting, and we will kill you and take them anyway." "What guarantee do I have?" Cassandra called back, playing for time while Webb repositioned himself for a better shot. "My word as a professional," Peters replied with dark humor. "I have never broken a deal with anyone who lived to complain about it." Negotiation was interrupted by a commotion from upstream shots and gunfire that suggested Sarah Chun had run into more of Murdoch's men. Cassandra felt a sick certainty that their journalist ally had been captured or killed, along with the precious documents that represented their only hope of exposing the truth. But Webb was studying the canyon walls with the practiced eye of someone who had fought in similar terrain during the Apache Wars. "There," he said quietly, pointing to a narrow ledge about 30 feet up the southern wall. "If we can reach that position, we can hold them off indefinitely." The climb was treacherous, made worse by the constant threat of sniper fire from Peter's men below. Cassandra's hands were bleeding by the time they reached the ledge, but they had achieved a commanding view of the entire canyon and forced their enemies to expose themselves if they wanted to continue the attack. "This is where we make our stand," Webb said with the calm acceptance of a soldier who had faced death many times before. "We cannot win, but we can make them remember this fight." But Cassandra was not ready to accept defeat. Her mind was racing through possibilities, looking for any advantage they might have missed. That was when she noticed the dark stain on the canyon wall above them, evidence of the flash floods that periodically roared through this narrow gorge with devastating force. "Captain," she said urgently, "what if we could trigger a flood? The creek is running higher than usual because of the spring snowmelt in the mountains." Webb followed her gaze and immediately understood what she was thinking. A quarter-mile upstream, a natural dam of fallen logs and debris had created a deep pool of water behind a wall of accumulated rock and timber. If that dam could be broken, the resulting flood would sweep through the canyon with enough force to scatter or kill Peters and his entire crew. "It would be suicide," Webb said bluntly. Someone would have to get to that dam and blow it up while under fire from those men down there. Then I will do it, Cassandra said with fierce determination. This is my fight, and my father's legacy is worth dying for. But before Webb could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed through the canyon once again. This time, however, the riders were coming from the opposite direction, and at their head rode Sarah Chun, very much alive and accompanied by a full troop of U.S. cavalry soldiers. This is Lieutenant Colonel Davis of the 6th Cavalry. A commanding voice rang out across the canyon. By order of Judge Harrison and the territorial government, you men are under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and corruption. Surrender your weapons immediately. The effect on Peters and his crew was immediate and devastating. They had been prepared to fight desperate fugitives, but facing federal troops was an entirely different proposition. Several of the hired guns threw down their weapons immediately, while others tried to flee only to find their escape routes blocked by cavalry troopers who had positioned themselves at every exit from the canyon. Peters himself made one last desperate attempt to complete his mission, raising his rifle toward Cassandra's position on the ledge. But Captain Webb's final shot took him in the chest, sending him tumbling into the creek where the current carried his body downstream like a piece of discarded refuse. As the dust settled and the cavalry troopers secured the surviving prisoners, Sarah Chun climbed up to the ledge where Cassandra and Webb waited. Her clothes were torn and she had a bloody scrape across one cheek, but her eyes were bright with triumph. Judge Harrison acted immediately when I showed him the documents, she explained breathlessly. He issued arrest warrants for Murdoch and all his associates, then sent the cavalry to find us before Peters could destroy the evidence. The ride into Tucson was like a victory parade, with the cavalry escort ensuring safe passage through territory that had been hostile just hours before. Word of Murdoch's arrest had already spread through the town, and crowds gathered along the main street to watch the procession that marked the end of an era of corruption and violence. At the territorial courthouse, Judge Harrison himself waited to receive the documents that would revolutionize justice in Arizona Territory. He was a stern-faced man in his 60s, with the bearing of someone who had seen the worst that humanity could offer, but had never stopped believing in the possibility of redemption. Miss Vale, he said formally as Cassandra handed over her father's will on the supporting evidence, these documents represent more than just your inheritance. They are the foundation for dismantling a criminal organization that has poisoned this territory for over a decade. The trial that followed made headlines across the nation. Sarah Chun's newspaper articles brought national attention to the corruption that had plagued Arizona Territory, while the evidence Cassandra had preserved sent Murdoch and his remaining associates to federal prison for life. But for Cassandra, the real victory came when she rode out to the ranch that had been her father's legacy, thousands of acres of prime grazing land stretching toward the distant mountains, with a main house that bore the marks of 12 years of neglect, but still stood solid and proud against the desert sky. Standing on the front porch of her father's house, looking out over the land that was finally hers by right as well as law, Cassandra felt the presence of Samuel Vale like a warm wind blowing across the range. He had died fighting for justice, but his daughter had lived to see that fight completed. The hired hands who had worked the ranch under Murdoch's ownership gathered in the yard, uncertain about their future under new management. But Cassandra had learned her father's lessons well. She offered fair wages, honest treatment, and the chance to be part of something better than the corrupt system they had all endured for too long. This ranch belongs to all of us now, she told them simply. We are going to run it the way my father would have wanted, with honor, integrity, and respect for every person who calls this place home. As the sun set over her father's land, her land now, Cassandra touched the worn leather of Samuel Vale's will one final time before placing it carefully in the ranch safe. The documents had served their purpose, but the real work of building a legacy was just beginning. The Arizona Territory still faced challenges and dangers, but at least one corner of it would stand as proof that justice could triumph over corruption when people were willing to fight for what was right. Samuel Vale's daughter had come home at last, and she intended to make sure his dream of an honest ranch in an honest territory would endure for generations to come. 2 months after the trial, Cassandra stood in the main corral watching her new foreman, James McKenna, work with a young stallion that had been running wild in the mountains. McKenna had arrived the day after Murdoch's arrest, ready to help rebuild the ranch that he had served faithfully under her father's leadership years ago. "Your father always said this land would produce the finest horses in the territory," McKenna said as he approached the fence where Cassandra stood. "With proper care and honest dealing, we can make that dream come true." The ranch was already showing signs of recovery under honest management. The workers who had stayed were putting their hearts into the job now that they knew their efforts would be rewarded fairly. The cattle were healthier, the buildings were being repaired, and word was spreading throughout the territory that the Vale Ranch was once again a place where a man could work with dignity. Sarah Chun had returned to San Francisco to write a book about corruption in the Arizona territory, but she maintained a regular correspondence with Cassandra. Her articles had sparked a federal investigation that was cleaning up territorial politics from top to bottom. Several other corrupt ranchers had been arrested, and honest officials were finally able to do their jobs without fear of retaliation. Captain Webb had accepted Cassandra's offer to serve as the ranch's security chief, a position that allowed him to use his military skills to protect something worth defending rather than simply fighting endless battles against an unjust system. His presence alone was enough to discourage the few remaining criminals who might have been tempted to test the new management. But the greatest change was in Cassandra herself. The frightened young woman who had fled Tombstone with stolen documents had transformed into a confident ranch owner who commanded respect throughout the territory. She had learned to balance her father's idealism with the practical realities of running a large operation in dangerous country. The evening ritual of checking the stock and securing the ranch for the night had become one of her favorite parts of each day. As she walked through the corrals and pastures, greeting the horses and cattle that were now thriving under proper care, she felt connected to the land in a way that went beyond mere ownership. Standing on the same spot where her father had once planned his daily operations, Cassandra could almost hear Samuel Vale's voice carried on the desert wind. He had died believing that honest work and fair dealing could create something lasting in the harsh beauty of the Arizona territory. His daughter was living proof that he had been right. The ranch hands were gathering around the bunkhouse for their evening meal, their voices carrying across the yard as they discussed the next day's work. These were good men who had been trapped in a corrupt system through no fault of their own. Now they had the chance to be part of something better, and their loyalty to Cassandra was absolute. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Cassandra made her way back to the main house that had been her father's home and was now hers. The building had been restored to its original condition, with the additions and modifications that Murdoch had made stripped away to reveal the simple, honest architecture that Samuel Vale had preferred. In her father's study, now her own, Cassandra kept the documents that had started this entire adventure safely locked away. But more importantly, she kept his journals and letters, learning about the man who had been taken from her when she was too young to remember him clearly. Samuel Vale had been a dreamer, but he had also been a practical man who understood that dreams required hard work and constant vigilance to become reality. He had written extensively about his hopes for the ranch and for the territory, envisioning a time when Arizona would be known for honest dealing and fair treatment of all its citizens. That time was finally arriving, thanks in large part to the courage of his daughter and the evidence she had preserved against all odds. The Vale Ranch was becoming a model for other operations throughout the territory, proving that success did not require corruption or violence. As Cassandra prepared for sleep in the bedroom that had once been her father's, she felt a deep sense of peace that had been missing from her life for as long as she could remember. She had found her true home at last, not just in terms of geography, but in terms of purpose and identity. The challenges were far from over. Running a large ranch in Arizona Territory required constant attention to weather, markets, politics, and the ever-present threat of violence from those who preferred the old ways of doing business. But Cassandra had proven that she possessed both the courage and the intelligence needed to meet those challenges head-on. Tomorrow would bring new problems and new opportunities, but tonight she could rest in the knowledge that Samuel Vale's legacy was secure. His ranch would continue to operate with the honesty and integrity he had valued above profit, and his daughter would ensure that his dream of a better Arizona Territory would continue to grow and flourish. The desert wind whispered through the cottonwood trees that her father had planted around the main house, carrying with it the promise of rain and the eternal hope of renewal that defined life in the American Southwest. Cassandra Vale had come home to claim her birthright, and she would spend the rest of her life proving worthy of the sacrifice her father had made to preserve it.